You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City. Unfortunately, my co-host Prashant Parmeswaran can't be here today, so this episode will include a very special guest. Joining me today is Danny Russel. Danny is Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute here in New York City. A career member of the Senior Foreign Service at the U.S. Department of State, Danny most recently served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Prior to his appointment as Assistant Secretary on July 12, 2013, almost exactly 6 years ago, Danny served at the White House as a Special Assistant to President Obama and on the National Security Council as Senior Director for Asian Affairs. He played an important role in the formation of the Obama administration's Pivot to Asia or Rebalance strategy. Danny, thanks a lot for joining me today on the Asia Geopolitics podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Ankit.
Great. It's really great to have you. Prashant and I, my usual co-host, have actually spent some time on this podcast that's been going now for 5 years. And I recall back in the day, we would actually talk about your activities in your official capacity. So it's very nice to have sort of a living piece of, Obama administration era Asia policy on the Asia Geopolitics podcast with us. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Well, the rebalance lives in Danny Russel.
All right, yeah, that's I think that's pretty apparent. So the reason we have you on the podcast today is to talk about your recent effort at the Asia Society Policy Institute. So you and your team have just put out a report on the Belt and Road Initiative, which we've talked about a lot on this podcast, and I suspect most of our listeners are acquainted with the basics of what BRI is. So I won't go into that kind of fundamental. And the report is really a breath of fresh air. There's a lot of these sorts of reports that have been coming out from Western think tanks recently talking about BRI. And it's a breath of fresh air in the sense that it's largely prescriptive for Chinese officials. And I'll include a link to the report in the podcast description so our listeners can go and follow up and read it for themselves if they're interested. But I wanted to begin by just asking you if you could tell us a bit about the genesis of this project that you undertook and led at the Asia Society Policy Institute. What sort of led ASPI to focus on the BRI and take this sort of a very heavy-handed prescriptive approach?
Well, I was, intrigued by the debate about the Belt and Road Initiative and somewhat troubled, frankly, by the conflicting analyses and interpretations of it. It struck me that it's something of an inkblot test, a Rorschach test, where the way that people perceived the BRI typically said more about their attitude towards China than it did about the initiative itself. And you have people viewing it as this wonderful 21st century Silk Road uniting the Eurasian continent in a network of trade and energy routes, connectivity. You have other people looking at it as a neo-colonial form of spheres of influence via state capitalism. So it was kind of Manichaean in the first instance, so I was intrigued. Secondly, I come to this as a recovering government official, as a policymaker, as a diplomat. And I'd been on the receiving end of more blue ribbon reports than you could shake a stick at. And by and large, as a government official, as a policy practitioner, I seldom found them usable, yet let alone useful. There were prescriptions always at the end about buy low, sell high, do good, make the other guy stop hating you. And that's just not useful. It's not actionable. And related to that also was just the perception that this sort of clash of images surrounding Belt and Road was not only not constructive, but it wasn't necessarily rooted in reality. And I set out to try to explore it a bit and separate fact from fiction, just for my own edification. And having done that, just my natural bent was to see if I couldn't identify some practical, actionable suggestions or recommendations. Or when I began, I thought I would perhaps find some best practices that I could lift up and encourage the Chinese decision makers and implementers to sort of do more of the right thing. Mm-hmm. And because the world's a big place and Belt and Road is a huge initiative, I decided to zero in on the ASEAN 10 countries, Southeast Asia, sort of a microcosm of, developed and less developed countries, countries that, if nothing else, were no strangers to China. They all have a lot of coping mechanisms. They all have a lot of experience. And I figured, hey, if countries that know China best run into big problems, imagine the struggle that far-flung regions like Africa and elsewhere have in dealing with China. So we looked at financing, we looked at labor, we looked at environment, we looked at kind of the local stakeholder engagement. We looked at the issue of corruption. And I was lucky enough to put together a kind of brain trust of experts in these various fields to sort of help guide me on what I should be looking at, what I should be looking for, what it meant, how to interpret it, and that sort of thing. And I came away with a number of sort of findings, frankly, and conclusions. And from that, over time, I was able to build out some prescriptions, not as the kind of high-handed, Westerner telling the Chinese what to do, but with a lot of sympathy as somebody who had a considerable number of years in government, responsible for coordinating and implementing policies, and who was hungry for advice and news and suggestions and recommendations that were actionable, that were usable.
Mm-hmm. So I found very interesting that in your introductory letter to the report, you identified 5 premises. And I think these premises are actually quite a productive place to start thinking about the BRI, and I'll just summarize them for our listeners really briefly. So the BRI meets demand for infrastructure that exists in Asia and elsewhere. The BRI is here to stay. The BRI is big enough that improvements to its standards will be a big deal for the BRI in the future. That Chinese initiatives generally move from sort of amorphous slogans to more structured programs. And finally, that BRI's costs will end up likely posing a problem for China in the long term. And of course, we're recording this podcast just right after the latest quarterly GDP numbers came out from China, showing the slowest growth rate quarterly since the early 1990s, 6.2%. But as you were writing the report, I assume that you began with these premises, and then as you sort of embarked on your journey exploring the BRI and talking to, as you said, your brain trust of experts, did you sort of come back to any of these premises and sort of rethink what they were saying about BRI, or did you find that these still generally held and are still a productive sort of 5 pillars to use to think about the BRI and its future?
I thought, frankly, they were reinforced by the things that I found. There is a huge appetite for infrastructure investment, including from China. And while there have been a lot of problems and there is a great deal of trepidation on the part of host countries, they are trying to figure out ways that they can accept the investment, accept the projects, while protecting their sovereignty and sort of mitigating or minimizing the downside risks. So they're not in the just say no motif. Something that I felt even more strongly after reconnoitering around some of the Southeast Asian countries and looking at and learning more about their projects was that you can't beat something with nothing. And for all of its vaunted talk about the Build Act and free and open Indo-Pacific, et cetera, notwithstanding very significant amounts of overseas development aid by the U.S. and by Japan, notwithstanding the quality infrastructure initiative by Japan, et cetera. The fact of the matter is that BRI, by and large, is up against pretty close to nothing. There is no really comparable option for most developing countries, in part because the World Bank has gradually skewed away from investments in the least developed countries, and in part because the rigor that the World Bank and that many Western governments apply in evaluating projects and designing them and so on is more than the local governments in the developing world can handle. I think these premises held. There's a sixth premise that I was a little too careful to actually put into print, which is that, and something that I've learned from my own diplomatic experience, namely that China, the Chinese leadership, is in fact quite sensitive to international criticism. And the sort of reputational lever is a device for moving China. And while obviously criticism and pressure can backfire in dealing with China, I thought that it was worth testing the proposition that China would be hungry for ways that they could, within reason, mitigate much of the international criticism, or at least raise questions among the potentially open-minded countries that BRI was not this sort of diabolical plot for global domination that it is often made out to be in the West.
Mm-hmm. And I think we saw direct evidence of that at least last year at the Boao Forum for Asia. President Xi's opening speech, I think he specifically pushed back at that notion. That, at least in my memory, is one of the first kind of high-level moments when Xi Jinping himself said that we don't have ulterior geopolitical motives. I think they reinforced that again at the Shangshan Forum and other sort of high-level fora. I just want to circle back a bit on your point about demand and lack of alternatives. Didn't Japan really write the book on strategic overseas development assistance in Asia and specifically in Southeast Asia? And they've seen quite a bit of success employing that strategically. So I'm wondering, in the course of your research, I know this wasn't the focus of the project, but how did you find these Southeast Asian countries sort of viewing Japan's role? Obviously, Japan is currently in decline in many ways, but it does continue to be very active in the overseas development assistance space in Asia.
Well, it won't come as a surprise to anybody who's had experience in Southeast Asia that at one level, some of the countries in the region are licking their chops at the opportunity to start, in effect, a bidding war between Japan and China over who is going to win the honor of providing the bridge or the high-speed rail or the soccer stadium, etc. And the countries concerned are not averse and not without skill in exploiting that. Now, what China is doing through BRI is not overseas development. This is almost shockingly disconnected with the aid or the traditional government-directed assistance to developing countries that the U.S., Japan, other Western countries actively practice. And then China does to some degree. There's not only little or no correlation between overseas development from Beijing and Belt and Road initiatives, but I at one point saw some figures that strongly suggested that there was virtually no overseas development assistance by China to Belt and Road countries. Now, of course, Japanese companies and sort of public-private Japanese infrastructure investment initiatives are pretty significant and extensive throughout Southeast Asia. But here too, some of the flaws of BRI are perceived as virtues in the eyes of the Southeast Asian beholders, and that's probably true more broadly in the developing world. Namely, your doorbell rings and the Chinese construction company equivalent of an Avon sales lady says, "Here's what I've got for you. I'm going to build you a big, beautiful fill in the blank facility, railway, stadium, free trade zone, industrial park, whatever. Here's the financing. Here's the blueprints. Here's what it's going to look like. I can start tomorrow." Chinese companies are very good at engineering. They are very fast, and they've come with the money. Now, there are all sorts of problems associated with that money, quite apart from the strings attached. The fact is that they're often hawking a project that is vastly overpriced. They are often uh, selling something on a scale that a small developing country like Laos, for example, just couldn't possibly afford. And that leads down the road to all kinds of problems, environmental problems, financial sustainability problems, corruption problems, etc. But for the purchaser in a developing country, the idea that I can get this project, I don't have to go through a lot of laborious planning about what our needs are and what the long-term environmental implications are. This is quick, wham bam, and it seems on the front end eminently affordable. That's a pretty powerful marketing device. And now China, now that Belt and Road is beginning to mature, is contending with the consequences and the
Mhm.
after effects of that approach. Many of the problems that we diagnosed are directly or indirectly attributable to this wild, headlong rush on the part of the Chinese to get to yes, sign on the bottom line, and the leapfrogging over the due diligence, over the serious project planning, over the needs assessment, over how a project would integrate into sort of other parts of the social or economic development plan in a given country, and leapfrogging over authentic environmental and social impact assessments. And as a result, in the short term, you have a number of projects that have been delayed, have stalled out, stopped, or in the case of Myanmar or in the case of Malaysia, have been radically renegotiated and not to China's favor. So there's a lot of corner cutting. I think that it seemed pretty clear that there are some longer term time bombs embedded in some of the BRI projects, and those are environmental problems that take years to surface, but that are going to be, in some cases, very problematic and raise the question of what kind of liability, either straight up legal or financial liability or political liability, will be laid at China's doorstep. One of the other conclusions that I reached is that China takes a very laissez-faire approach to uh, the responsibilities of the host country, under the guise of non-interference in another country's affair. And what that means is that while a project in China, a domestic project, would be pretty strictly controlled in terms of stakeholder engagement or environmental review. There would be a complaint mechanism for sort of disgruntled villagers. The Chinese would, presumably in their anti-corruption campaign, be pretty alert to bid padding and bribery and so on. The identical infrastructure facility, dam or port or whatever, built in somebody else's country, hey, that's another story entirely. And while it may well be technically true that the real responsibility for making sure that displaced villagers get compensation and that anti-bribery rules are upheld, et cetera, rests with the local authorities, a lot of the countries where BRI projects are being conducted don't have strong institutions or good governance
Mhm.
systems, and the Chinese developers and maybe others in the Chinese system seem to turn a blind eye, if not actually profit from that.
Well,
Um,
so when you took, all of these sort of technical recommendations and best practices and sort of deeper thinking about about the possible liabilities in the future, as you said. When you took these and you presented them to your Chinese interlocutors, how were these ideas received? Because as you noted, that the Chinese do have a degree of sensitivity, at least on the reputational side, when BRI is talked about as a geostrategic threat. But many of these technical criticisms, I feel like, are sort of a genre separate from that broader discussion that happens in terms of BRI as a geopolitical grand plan. So when you presented these ideas in China, how were they taken?
Well, I tried to formulate the recommendations. I mean, the findings were the findings, but the recommendations, to the extent possible, were formulated in a constructive way as practical remedies. And you'll see if you're looking at the report that I tried to be explicit not only about what the international benchmark was, and not only trying to find precedents within China domestically for how they do it, and policies and procedures at home in China that would yield better outcomes overseas. But I tried to show what's in it for them. How will this lead to better outcomes that China cares about? How will this sort of mitigate risks and reduce political backlash in the BRI countries, et cetera? So I combine that, I think, with what are some pretty basic diplomatic principles, which is to pass up the opportunity to wrap my report in a brick and throw it through Xi Jinping's window. This was not presented as an attack on China, an attack on BRI. It was laid out as steps that are within China's power to take that would have clear benefits both for China and for the project country. The other thing that I did, Ankit, again, this is diplomacy 101, is that I chose my moment a month or so before the scheduled second Belt and Road Forum. And I brought the findings and the recommendations informally, the preliminary ones, to Beijing quietly, long before I issued the report publicly. And I met serially with a wide range of Chinese stakeholders, beginning with the NDRC, with the people who have perhaps the greatest direct responsibility for Belt and Road. Explain to them what I found, why, and in a non-threatening environment, allow them to begin to digest the practical recommendations. And I took this around to the Finance Ministry, Foreign Ministry, MOFCOM, to China Exim Bank, and some of the other policy banks, and so on. And so I socialized it in a way that perhaps suggested that this was not coming in as an attack on China, even though it was highly critical, as the Chinese themselves acknowledge. And B, that it was not going to be a surprise, because no one after their 6th birthday really likes to be surprised. And that's doubly true for government officials, and it's triply true for government officials in a authoritarian state.
Right. So I want to sort of end the BRI discussion before we move on to a second topic I want to talk to you about. What's sort of a tough question about the Obama administration area. So I, at the time in 2015, writing in my capacity as a private citizen, I was quite critical of the way in which the administration handled the launch of the AIIB, specifically the decision by American allies to sign up. And I'm wondering, reading your report, I was just wondering if you had sort of, in hindsight, the same kind of misgivings that I did about the AIIB, and whether the U.S. might have played that in a more productive way and sort of gotten its foot in the door. I'd be really curious about your perspectives from what was going on back then to where the AIIB has now come in mid-2019.
Right. Well, I saw the arc of the development of the AIIB as something of a model for what we collectively, by we I mean the West, ought to want BRI to evolve towards. Because in fairness, the AIIB initiative at the very early stages was an opaque Chinese mystery initiative where countries were being asked to sign essentially a blank piece of paper by a pig in a poke that China was purporting to solve a problem that others didn't see and create an institution, an Asian Development Bank that already existed. And there was every reason to be suspicious that, in fact, this was simply going to be an instrument of Chinese national policy. That it was going to be the China Infrastructure Investment Bank, and not a bona fide multilateral effort, and certainly not something that adhered to the kinds of standards that have evolved in the World Bank or the ADB and elsewhere. And my argument to the Chinese at the time was that the starting point for any new multilateral bank needs to be the high watermark of what to date the other best multilateral banks have achieved. Now, there was a lot of debate internally in the US and with our partners about whether joining and reforming from within was a good strategy, or let alone a better strategy than holding back and making China prove its bona fides and its commitment to standards and rules and so on. There never was a question about the United States joining AIIB. Congress, we have trouble getting appropriations for the international banks that we already belong to. We were never going to get the money. Without a doubt, the administration flubbed the messaging, and we allowed a narrative to take hold that asserted that the U.S. in a kind of mean-spirited way was trying to, exterminate and block and keep people away from AIIB. That was highly exaggerated, but it nevertheless became the perceived truth, and that was unfortunate. I think, though, the analogy and the connection to the BRI is not like should we join, should we have joined, but what suite of actions, what concert of countries, what sort of set of messages can propel the BRI up from the many questionable practices and the lack of standards to follow that incremental improving trajectory that the AIIB took and brought it to where it is today, which is as a sort of highly, a AAA rated, credible multilateral infrastructure bank.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think we'll close the discussion on BRI there. Danny, thanks a lot for sharing perspectives on your report. Again, I'll recommend that listeners at least take the time to flip through the report. I'll include a link to that in the description so you can go ahead and take a look at that. But Danny, it's not every day that I have a former Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs on the podcast. So I wanted to sort of take advantage of this opportunity to talk to you about a little bit newsier of a topic, which is the ongoing crisis between Japan and South Korea, two of our most important allies in Northeast Asia. We actually devoted the last episode of the podcast to this very issue, so if listeners need sort of a primer on where the dispute comes from, which again, for reasons of time, I'm not going to go back over in this discussion, I'd recommend listening to that. But Danny, so David Stilwell, who now has your old job and is the first Senate-confirmed official to have that job in a non-acting capacity since the Trump administration came into office, is in the region. He was just in Tokyo. He will be going to Seoul after his brief trip to the Philippines. But the United States, it seems like, is not going to play a role in mediating trilaterally. And that's not surprising. America has been reticent to do that in disputes between Seoul and Tokyo in the past for good reason. But I wanted to ask you, if you had to sort of give advice to anybody listening to this podcast at the State Department today, or perhaps at the NSC, what would your sort of advice be to a budding sort of American diplomat looking to sort of talk down our two allies from the brink in this crisis that's sort of an unprecedented nature, in the sense that the economic relationship between the two of them is really at the core of the stakes here?
Wow. Well, look, Dave Stilwell is coming in after a two and a half year gap where we've only had acting and senior bureau officials and sort of great people, but uh, not people in the position of assistant secretary, and not people who are perceived as having the full authority and confidence of the President of the United States. And that's a huge challenge and a huge handicap for Dave. And I'm deeply sympathetic, and I certainly wish him well. There's no quick fix. There is no dose of penicillin that he or the U.S. can administer to Japan and Korea to cure this uh, serious downward spiral, this sort of toxic series of slaps between the two capitals. It is hugely serious. It's immensely destructive. It is compromising U.S. national security and economic interests. We're in a sort of recreating the Turkey-Greece schism in NATO, during the Cold War. The world really can't afford this, and the United States in particular can't afford it. Um, but it's not a new phenomenon. It is simply that the wheels have come off, that the bottom seems to have fallen out. And I think that it is in no small measure attributable to the lack of confidence in the United States, the tremendous uncertainty in the region in general, and in allied capitals in particular, about America's orientation, about America's dependability, about the unilateralist trend in U.S. policy. Remember, America first is not exactly a rallying cry to give confidence to our allies, particularly with accusations about freeloading and muttering about withdrawing U.S. troops and so on. So we, I think, are looking at a very anxiety-laden and an unstable environment right now, combined with a number of other factors, political, historical, and others, that are allowing this sort of conflagration to escalate. It's incredibly dangerous. It is not that the U.S. should mediate, and Dave Stillwell was not incorrect to point this out. But this is a tough business. This diplomacy stuff, and it's clearly been interpreted as America doesn't have a stake in this issue, doesn't have is not seized with the problem. Obama. I mean, for Obama and for the Obama administration, and for me in particular, trying to contain friction between our two important allies in Northeast Asia, Japan and Korea, trying to accelerate the painfully slow accretion of confidence, willingness to collaborate, to cooperate, which was a high priority for security reasons in the first instance. This was not a matter of mediation; it was a matter of moderation. That the Obama administration and President Obama himself, who twice hosted trilateral summits with the Korean and Japanese leader, and who sort of fostered an environment that inhibited this kind of retaliatory, knee-jerk nationalism, that created a strong sense of common strategic interests. We helped to build, and we certainly fed the factors and the forces that pushed back against the instinct to lash out that generated some confidence and political and strategic rationale for taking a certain amount of risk in not seizing every opportunity to take the most politically advantageous position of attacking the Japanese or attacking the South Koreans. It's an ongoing process. It's a lot of work, and the critical factor, I'd say two critical factors. One was that this policy and this effort was unmistakably owned by the President of the United States. No one in Tokyo or Seoul questioned for a moment that when I came or when John Kerry came and made our case that the U.S. government wasn't speaking with a single voice, that this wasn't President Obama. But secondly, that we made the case always on the basis of our own rightful interest, our equity in the Japan-Korea relationship. Mm-hmm. So the inability of the Japanese and South Korean troops, militaries, to share information, the sort of asymmetry in terms of who could get what for a variety of reasons, the lack of connectivity at a moment when all of us were challenged very directly by North Korea's growing nuclear and missile program, when all of us recognized the need to contribute to regional confidence and stability as China's massive military modernization project unfolded. That is the strongest basis for us to make the argument. It's not time out, stop hitting your sister, don't kick him under the table. It's we have an equity here. We have a right to have a view, and by the way, we have a shared interest. And just as you have faith in the United States' commitment to regional stability, to Northeast Asia, peace and security, we need to have faith that Japan and Korea will and can cooperate on critical security issues. Now we see not only are they not able to cooperate on security issues, but this battle is spilling over into the economic sphere.
Mm-hmm. Well, Danny, I want to thank you so much for joining me today on the show. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today, but I'd be very happy to have you back on the show to talk about any number of other issues related to U.S.-Asia policy. So really, thanks for taking the time today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Anke. I appreciate it.
Great, and we'll hope you'll be back soon. For listeners, thanks for listening to the Asia Geopolitics podcast. If you like what you heard on this discussion and you'd like to keep up with future episodes, make sure you subscribe. You can do that on Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, or any other number of podcast providers. And finally, if you've been a subscriber for a while but you haven't yet left us a rating on any of these services, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast was brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.